Okay, so I'm gonna check the chat here. Can folks see the PowerPoint presentation all right? Or at least is this showing up all right? Okay, sweet. Um, so we're gonna get started here, and this will be the first webinar, sort of kicking off our winter webinar series. I want to start by just thanking everyone who registered for joining and listening to this. The registration costs for the webinar go right back to our project, so this is really helpful for keeping our work going and allows us a really fun time to share our work with everyone as well. Um, One thing that worth noting, I know I'm going to talk, I think it's going to be about an hour, my presentation will be. And then my hope is then to have Q&A and try to answer, if we have enough time, everyone's questions. I'm going to stick around for an hour, hour and a half to answer any questions folks have. For any questions you do have, make sure to put them in the Q&A. Don't put them in the chat. If you put them in the chat, I'm probably going to miss them. So there's a Q&A function. If you're not familiar with Zoom, there's a I can't remember, somewhere on that little bar there. You can hit the Q&A, put a question, and I'll just go off of that. Oops. Okay, so today we're talking about a very not controversial topic, which is wolves, deer hunting, and wolf management. And the goal of tonight's talk is to really look into the data. And I was obviously joking, it is quite controversial depending who you ask. And there's a lot of anecdotes and a lot of things that you read on social media, see in the news. And so the hope here was to really look at the data, some of which we've collected, and then other data that exists to understand what's really sort of the truth behind these things. You know, we hear simultaneously that we need to start hunting and killing wolves to help deer populations. Then other folks say we can't hunt or kill them because the population is going to be endangered. So we're going to look at what the data actually says and then hopefully explore some of those patterns. So, a brief overview of the Voyageurs Wolf Project. I assume most people here are aware of what we do, but I just kind of want to touch on it if anyone's unfamiliar. So we're a University of Minnesota research project, and we started doing our work in 2015. So we've been doing this work for about a decade now. And a lot of our emphasis throughout most of our project has been focusing on the summer ecology of wolves, which is the summer ecology of wolves means the ecology from the time that wolves have pups in April to the time those pups are reared in late fall. And so it's really about a 7 month period of time. And that's been a time when wolves are generally quite difficult to study. And so that's what we were focused on. But we do work in the winter as well, and I'll talk a little bit about how we've expanded our work through time to start doing a winter predation aspect as well. The overarching goal of our project is really to couple sort of cutting edge, novel, rigorous wolf research with really effective outreach and education so that we can not only do the work and learn, but also share that with other folks and make that hopefully really accessible to other people. We study wolves in an area that we call the Greater Voyageurs ecosystem, and this includes Voyageurs National Park. So this is a map right here. This is Voyageurs National Park in the northern part of the Greater Voyageurs ecosystem. And then there's a lot of land outside of the park as well. And then Ontario, Canada is just across the border here. We have what you're seeing in this map are just the GPS tracks of collared wolves in the various packs that are in the GVE. There are wolves in other areas here that we don't have any tracks, and those are just packs that we haven't had collars on when I made this map. The GVE is about 2,300 square kilometers, and depending on the year, have anywhere between 23 to 24 packs that are in or partially within the boundaries of this area. The Greater Voyageurs ecosystem is a unique place to study wolves in part because it's sustained really high wolf densities for a very long time. So this graph here shows the population trend of wolves in this area, and it shows it in terms of wolf density. So we don't measure the number of individual wolves. I mean, we do that, but we quantify our population in terms of the density because wolves don't really care about the boundaries of a study area or a national park. And so the best way to quantify wolf populations is wolf density, and that's measured in the number of wolves per 1,000 square kilometers. And that's what we have here. And what we can see is our average densities are about 60 wolves per 1,000 square kilometers. And if you could line up all the studies that have been done on wolves, that would be on the very high end of wolf densities relative to most places. Obviously, our population through time is actually remained fairly stable, and that doesn't mean it doesn't fluctuate. We obviously see there's some pretty substantial fluctuations, but by stable, I mean that the population isn't increasing or decreasing with time. The GVE was also one of the few places in North America where wolves were never extirpated. So wolves have always been here. They've never had to sort of recolonize the area. And based on work going back to the 1980s, 1990s, we would estimate that the population has likely remained at a similar density for the past 20 to 30 years, at least, given sort of that earlier work that was done. So, like I said, the focus tonight is to examine the relationship between wolves and deer, and then also deer hunting. What impact do wolves have on deer and deer hunting in the GVE? And then also to understand what impact a wolf hunting and trapping season might have in terms of its impact on deer populations and deer hunting success, as well as how that might impact wolf populations in the area as well. Importantly, what this talk is not is a statement for or against wolf hunting and trapping. And I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to circle back to this, but really, this is a time to look at what the data indicates and isn't a statement about the values or merits associated with wolf hunting and trapping. And in part, the reason why is that the science is pretty clear, and like I said, I'll talk about this soon, that wolf populations are very resilient to hunting and trapping. And so we'll kind of talk about at the end, what do you actually make of the data presented here and how that influences maybe how you think about wolf management. So the data that I'm going to be presenting today comes from a variety of sources. Some of it's data that we've collected, and then obviously much of it also comes from places like the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, who collects data on wolf populations, depredations, deer hunter success, and all sorts of other information. When I've used data that's not from our project, I've tried to include the source where we got that. Most of it's publicly available so that you can go look at those things if you're interested in it. So on the Voyageurs Wolf Project, one of the things that we do is we estimate wolf and prey populations in our area annually. And obviously the goal there is to understand sort of wolf-prey relationships. So we do it for wolves, which I just talked about. We do it for deer, moose, beavers, and snowshoe hares as well. So now we have sort of a 10-year data set that allows us to look at these patterns through time. In terms of the data I'm going to be talking about with deer hunting, as I mentioned, the Minnesota DNR collects data on deer hunting. So when the deer hunting season rolls around, hunters have to buy licenses for certain deer permit areas, and then they have to report if they harvested a deer in a deer permit area and what kind of deer they harvested. And all of the information about Minnesota's deer harvesting is available online. So this gives you an idea of what that deer permit system or deer permit area looks like. This is the northeastern part of the state. The GVE is this up in this area right here. So we overlap DPAs 107, 109, 177, 119, and 118. But for what I'm going to be talking about for the next little bit, I'm going to be referring to a lot of the deer permit areas in the northeastern part of the state, which is often called the arrowhead of Minnesota, and that kind of refers to this area right here. This area is sort of the forested zone of northern Minnesota that often has harsh winters. There's robust wolf populations, and this is where a lot of work historically has been done on wolf-deer interactions in the state. So one of the reasons that we sort of got interested in looking at this issue over the past couple of years is because there's been a lot of concern over a declining deer harvest, particularly in northern Minnesota. For about the past couple years, it's been particularly poor, and then before that, there was still a declining trend through time. And obviously, one of the thoughts was that wolves might be to blame in part of this decline. And so we really wanted to understand what these relationships were and to really dig in to see what our data indicates. So this graph here shows sort of that change in deer hunting in wolf range in Minnesota over the past about 12 years or 11 years, I think. And we can see that deer harvest numbers were pretty high in 2012, and then they dropped pretty quickly in 2014. 2014 is when we had a very severe winter across much of the Great Lakes states. Then that sort of harvest increased to 2017, and then it's been on this sort of slow decline since then. So when you look at this, it seems pretty clear cut that deer harvest is going down, and it does appear to be going down. But one thing that's very important to note is that total harvest, so the total number of deer harvested, which is usually the metric that you hear in news articles and things like that, is not a good metric really to assess changes in deer hunting success. And the reason why is we know that hunters across much of Minnesota and North America are declining through time. And so as you have less people in the field, you're going to harvest less deer. And so we really think a better metric to examine this is to use what we're going to call deer hunter success rates, which is the number of deer harvested per hunter, because that is going to show you or give you a better index of how harvest patterns are changing through time. So this is just to illustrate that point. What this graph is showing is on the y-axis, we have number of deer hunters in a permit area. On the x-axis, we have deer harvested in that permit area. Each one of these dots represents a year of data from a deer permit area in northeastern Minnesota, and then each color represents a different deer permit area. And what we see pretty clearly is that as the number of deer hunters increases, the number of deer harvested increases as well. So if you're not accounting for a changing number of hunters, you're not going to get a really accurate understanding of how hunter success is really changing from year to year. Now I'm going to go back, I'm going to take this data here and now just show what that looks like by each deer permit area in northeastern Minnesota. And so each one of these is a different DPA. The blue line is the number of hunters, and the black is the number of deer harvested. And again, you can see that trend in all of these, or most of these DPAs, of a declining number of hunters and declining number of deer harvested. So then what we did is we took all that data and we actually then combined it to understand what and calculated hunter success rates for each deer permit area and then for the whole of northeastern Minnesota. And this is the result. The big purple dots and purple lines are the average or the total estimates. So if you added up all the data from all the deer permit areas in a given year and calculated a success rate, that's what the purple dots are. Then what we see in the background, these light lines, are the data from each individual DPA. And I know that adding those individual lines makes it look a bit messy, but the reason I did that is because it shows that there's a lot of synchrony in these deer permit areas through time. So when hunting's good in one deer permit area, that seems to be the case in the ones around it, and vice versa. So what we notice here is we see a pattern that is somewhat similar to that total deer harvest trend, except it's a little bit muted. You don't see quite as much of an up and down because this is accounting for the number of hunters through time. Nonetheless, we see that hunter success rates since about 2019 have been pretty low. Then we get to, interestingly, 2024. The data for this past hunting season hasn't been released publicly yet. I did ask the DNR for the results for the permit areas around our study area, and that's what this is based on. But based on all the public news articles that I've read and interviews with the DNR, it sounds like hunter success increased by about 9 or 10%, I think, in northern Minnesota this past year. So we will see this sort of increase like is indicated here. Okay, so that was all about northeastern Minnesota. Now we're going to zoom in to the greater Voyageurs ecosystem. And we're going to look at the data on deer hunting statistics from these 5 deer permit areas that the GVE either overlaps or is very close to. And then we're going to understand how those change based on the wolf and deer populations in these areas. And when we're doing this analysis, it's important to note that the assumption we're making is that our estimates of wolf and deer populations in our study area, we're assuming that they are representative of the general trend of the populations of wolves and deer in this larger area. We think that's probably a pretty fair assumption because a lot of this area is similar habitat, has similar weather conditions, similar predator guilds, and all sorts of things like that. So we think that's a fair assumption, but it is important to note that that's what we are assuming when we're doing this. So first, we're going to look at the question of what drives deer hunters' success in the greater Voyageurs ecosystem. In this graph here, I have the deer hunting success rates in those 5 deer permit areas around the greater Voyageurs ecosystem. That's the yellow line. And then the purple line is our estimates of the deer population in our study area. And what we notice is that since about 2015, these numbers or these statistics had been tracking each other very, very well. So basically, as the deer population went up, hunter success went up, and vice versa. And then we start to see in 2003 a real departure here, where our estimate of deer populations really declined, whereas hunter success rates increased just marginally. Importantly, 2022 and 2023, and I'll talk about this a couple times, were extreme winters in terms of winter severity. And so those seem to have had a big impact on deer populations and a lot of other things. I'll also note that we don't have an estimate for 2024 here. And the reason why is we estimate deer populations in the spring of every year. And then our estimate for a given year is the average of the 2 spring values. So for 2024, our estimate will be the average of spring 2024 and spring 2025. And the hope is that that average sort of captures the biological year of 2024. So soon we're going to get an estimate for this when spring arrives. And based on changes in hunter success rates, I'm anticipating that we'll probably see an increasing trend here this upcoming year. Now we can display this data in a different way. We can just look at the correlation between deer hunter success rates and deer populations based on our estimates. So all we're doing here is taking the data from this graph and then just kind of rearranging it. And what we note here is a pretty obvious pattern that as deer populations increase, deer hunter success rate increases and vice versa. And that probably doesn't surprise a whole lot of people. So big takeaway here is hunter success is driven by deer populations. So then obviously the question is what drives deer populations? And in particular, what is the relationship between wolves and deer in the greater Voyageurs ecosystem? Now, what some folks think is occurring and what has been shared with us from different people is that as time's gone on, we see the wolf population sort of continuing to increase in number. And while that's going on, the deer population is just going down and down. And this pattern is sort of continuing that way unless some sort of action is taken to fix it. So, in other words, if we take this pattern and put it into words, it's basically as wolves go up, deer go down, or there's a negative correlation between wolf and deer populations in our area and all of northern Minnesota. And so we can actually examine, is that the pattern that we see? And so when we look at our deer and wolf population estimates, we see some interesting patterns. In this graph, the deer population is this purple color, and then the wolves are the yellow color. And what we see is starting in 2015, all the way up through 2021, the wolf and deer population sort of tracked each other very well. Basically, as the deer changed, the wolves sort of followed that change. But then we see something really interesting happen in 2022 and 2023. We see that in these years, all of a sudden the deer population starts decreasing substantially, but the wolf population remains at a more elevated density. And the question is obviously what's going on there. Now remember that 2022 and 2023 were extreme winters, and I'm using that term extreme not because to sound sensational. That is how those winters were categorized based on the winter conditions by a winter severity index, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And so there's something that happened in that extreme winter that caused these populations, which were in essence in sync with one another, to all of a sudden get out of sync with one another. But nonetheless, for about 7 years, the wolf and deer populations were kind of, when one went up, the other went up, and vice versa. So we can take this data, rearrange it, and also look at what is the correlation between wolves and deer populations. And remember, one of the prevailing ideas is that there should be a negative correlation here. In other words, as wolves get more abundant, so once they're high, we should see a relationship that's kind of like this, so that you can't, in essence, have high wolf populations and high deer populations. But in theory, in reality, what we see here is this sort of positive, slightly increasing trend through time. So generally speaking, as there's more deer, there's more wolves. But as we'll notice, we have these 2 outliers here from these severe winters right here. And these are really driving that trend line and making it pretty flat. So what happens if we actually remove that data from those severe winters? Well, what we see here is a very strong correlation once you take out those two data points between wolf and deer populations. And so we see that basically well, it's a pretty, I think, impressive sort of correlation that as deer are increasing, wolf populations increase and vice versa. But there's something about those two extreme winters that really threw this relationship sort of out of whack for a little while. So, generally speaking, what appears to be the case, except for when we have, it seems like very harsh winters, is that deer populations, when they're high, wolf populations are high, and vice versa. And so, all of this generally indicates that wolf populations are driven by deer populations, not the other way around. So, wolves are responding to the deer, not deer responding to wolves, at least the vast majority of the time. And ultimately, that's not super surprising to us. Predator populations generally are driven by the abundance of their prey. And ecologists call this phenomenon the numerical response of predators. And there's a whole bunch of theory and modeling and statistics that go along to try to understand how predators respond to changes in prey abundance. And I'm not going to get into all of that. But there has been work looking at wolf populations specifically and how wolf populations respond to changes in prey. And the way that prey density or prey abundance is usually quantified in the literature of wolves, or in sort of peer-reviewed literature about wolves, is by quantifying prey biomass. So how many kilograms of prey are there in the landscape? So there's a paper in 2014 by McRoberts and Meach where they examined many studies across North America to understand the relationship between wolf density and prey biomass density. And what they conclude is that our findings indicate that wolf density is regulated by prey biomass. In other words, prey go up, wolves go up, and vice versa. Then in 2016, Meach and Barber Meyer took the data set from that previous paper and they actually analyzed it again and added a data point. And so this is that graph from their publication. We have here, this is the data point they added. And the reason they publish this is to show that even at high wolf densities, this pattern of wolves increasing as prey increases sort of holds. And so in this study, each dot is an individual location across North America where folks had recorded wolf densities and prey densities. So strong relationship between these two. What they also found is when running a statistical assessment is that prey biomass explained 81% of the variation in wolf density across North America. And that's pretty good in terms of explanatory power of why there are wolves and more wolves in some areas than others. So then what drives changes in deer populations if it doesn't appear to be wolves? And we think all evidence really indicates that it's ultimately winter conditions that are driving deer populations, through time. And we think that not because that's just our belief, but because when you look at the data, which I'm going to show in a second, that the data seems to indicate that that is a very important factor and the primary factor driving population change. So first, I want to talk a little bit about just measuring winter severity, because obviously how you quantify how severe a winter is and what winter conditions are like has an impact in terms of sort of what your results will be when you start assessing the impacts of winter. The Minnesota Department of Natural Resources uses a winter severity index, and I believe theirs is they take the number of days where I think there's above 15 inches of snow, and then they add that to the number of days that are below, I can't forget what temperature, and that yields a winter severity index. What we use is a different index, which is called the Accumulated Winter Weather Severity Index. This has nothing to do with wildlife, wolves, deer, anything like that. This is from a weather climate group out of Purdue University. And you can go on their website and you can actually look up at any one of these major weather stations what the winter severity is at a given time. So this graph here is what I found yesterday when I visited that. And this is for International Falls, Minnesota, which is just outside of Voyageurs National Park. And so right now, given the current winter conditions, we are in a mild winter per the data that they use to assess winter severity. And as I noted a couple slides ago, how we had extreme winters, that is referring to this extreme classification when they're assessing how severe a winter was. So then once the winter's, complete, each winter is given sort of a value, which in theory represents how severe it is. So the higher the value, the more severe a winter is. So what we did is we looked at how winter severity influenced changes in deer populations and changes in deer hunter success rates. This graph here shows the relationship between winter severity as measured by that accumulated winter weather severity index with the annual percent change in deer density, which is basically just population growth. How much did the population change from one year to the next? And if we put this little dashed line here, what this is showing is that any dot above this dashed line means population growth, and anything below this line is population decline for deer. And you notice a very compelling pattern here that when we have high winters, or winters that are very severe, like we've had recently, there's almost always population decline. When we have mild winters, there's almost always population increase. So there's a very strong correlation, it appears, between the changes in deer populations or deer population growth rates and winter severity. And again, we can look at the same pattern at how deer hunter success rate changes from one year to the next. And again, we see a very similar pattern that as winters become more severe, and I'm going to put this dashed line, which again represents declines in hunter success rates and increases in hunter success rates. And what we see is that as winters are more severe, we almost always see a decrease in hunter success rates. And when there's an increase, or sorry, we have mild winters, we almost always see an increase in hunter success rate. So decreases when there's severe winters, increases when there's mild winters. So to us, and this is based on 12 years of data, and to us that seems like a pretty compelling pattern. So when we indicate that we think winter conditions are ultimately driving deer populations, that's not intended to be that's not an advocacy statement, which often it's made to be, or an anti-wolf management statement. It's simply noting that that's what the data appears to indicate to us. And this is the data we're making those assessments on. Now, we also did examine, starting last winter, wolf predation patterns during the winter. And actually, last winter was a very fortuitous year to start doing this work because last winter was the mildest winter on record in northern Minnesota. We had very little snow and we had very warm temperatures. And mild winters are generally good for deer. And so, what we fortunately had was data on wolf predation on deer during the fall, winter, and then the following spring. So we could assess how wolf predation patterns changed and what the cumulative impact of wolf predation on deer was. And the big takeaways, and I'm not going to get into all the nitty-gritties, but what we really did is we went to every spot a wolf spent more than an hour during the winter. We visited those spots to identify all the kills that they've made of deer, which allowed us to quantify how frequently wolves are killing deer and then how much food wolves were getting from the deer that they were killing. And what we were able to determine by doing this is that wolves were unable to kill enough deer to meet their basic caloric needs. So a wolf in the greater Voyageurs ecosystem needs about 2.3 kilograms of food, of meat per day to sort of meet its basic energetic requirements, to basically maintain its body weight. And typically in the winter, that's when wolves are putting on body weight. They're putting on fat reserves because deer are in poor condition and wolves are more readily able to kill them. But that's not what we saw last winter. What we saw is that the average wolf that we were studying received somewhere around 1.5 to 2 kilograms of food per day. And this includes not only food from what they killed, but also from food that they were scavenging as well. And so all of this indicates that most wolves in our area lost body weight during this mild winter. And indeed, when we collared wolves this spring and early summer, a lot of wolves were very thin. You could tell they did not have the fat reserves that they typically do. After very hard winters, often wolves have very good fat reserves around their pelvis, and it's very obvious when you're collaring them that they're in good condition. But that was not the case this past year. We then quantified what predation levels were on deer during this mild winter. And what we were able to determine by really looking at this data from the fall, winter, and spring is that the average wolf in the biological year of 2023-2024 killed about 4.7 to 6.2 deer, depending on a few different assumptions. Um, and so to put that in perspective, that means, given our wolf densities and our deer densities in the greater Voyageurs ecosystem, that wolves killed somewhere around 15 to 20% of the deer population last winter. And you might be watching this thinking, wow, that's a lot of deer. And it probably is a lot of deer. But on a population level, it's worth taking those estimates and thinking through what they are in context. And so when we look at what impact predation has on deer populations, it's important to note that white-tailed deer, like species such as wolves, are can be very productive. They can have a lot of offspring. Does can sometimes have two offspring, and most of the does are going to have fawns the following year. And so deer populations are able to rebound quickly in the right circumstances and be very productive. And so all of our work seems to indicate that predation last year likely had very little impact on deer populations. And so when you go in the scientific literature and you read about how many deer need to be removed to start reducing deer population growth or stabilizing it, the estimates are somewhere around 25 to 40% of female deer need to be killed to do this. And these are from studies largely done in places where people are trying to reduce overabundant deer populations and trying to understand how many do hunters or sharpshooters need to remove to actually cause that population to start going down. And that's what these estimates are. Killing bucks doesn't have very much impact at all because bucks can mate with multiple does, and so they're just really not as important from a population growth standpoint as does are. And so all of the evidence that we have seen combined with sort of this understanding of how deer populations work is that deer populations in our area appeared to remain stable and possibly increased last year despite those levels of wolf predation. And indeed, hunter success rates in this area last year, or this past fall, increased by 14% relative to the previous year. And as we already showed, hunter success generally increases when deer populations increase. So despite these levels of predation, it didn't seem to really stop deer from probably increasing. And so that brings up an interesting point here. So if wolves are the primary driver of deer population change and not winters, then predation last winter should have been high to a level that would have really impeded deer to sort of either maintain their population level or grow. And that's particularly true because we know wolf density was high and we know deer density was low. But instead, we didn't see that pattern. Instead, we saw something that was very different than that. And we think that indicates, again, as additional evidence that winter is ultimately the primary driver of deer population change, not only in our area, but a lot of northern climates where you have wolves and deer interacting. So I only was able to get into a little bit of this, but we did publish these results of this study this last winter. It came out a couple of months ago, and if you want to read more about that study, you can go to our website, voyagerswolfproject.org, and go to our peer-reviewed publication section, and you can download the PDF of this. Okay, so winter conditions do appear to be the primary driving force of population change, but obviously there are other things that play as well. And one of those important things is habitat. And deer obviously have certain habitat needs. In the spring, summer, and fall, they need good habitat to forage on and to have fawns in that the fawns can hide and evade predators and other sources of mortality. And then obviously in the wintertime, what's really important for deer are having conifer or stands of conifers that provide cover from snow. The problem is in lots of northern Minnesota is that a lot of habitat is managed to promote young forests that don't have a lot of conifer cover. So there's a lot of habitat or forest management to promote aspen regeneration for pulpwood. And that's what we see here, where large areas are often clear cut. There's very little forest left. And then that kind of regenerates as aspen. And then when that forest gets to be about 40 to 45 years old, it's often logged again, and that cycle kind of continues. And really, the only way you can get old conifer forest is by letting forests get old, and that's not something that's happening a lot in our area. And the reason why this is important is that when we have harsh winters, or even winters in general, deer head for conifer stands because in those conifer stands, there's less snow accumulating on the forest floor, and that allows deer to get around and use less energy. And that energy conservation is important for them surviving the winter. In cuts such as you see here, which are very common throughout our area, these provide virtually no cover for deer in the winter. And so you often don't see a lot of deer activity when snows get deep in these sort of places because it's a lot of work for them to move through. And so habitat's a very difficult thing to change, especially when it comes to conifer cover, because that's a very long-term process. These forests take decades to actually mature and become what they are. But nonetheless, they are very important things when it comes to deer population and deer surviving winters. Now, what is important to say is or important to clarify, is that we're not saying that wolves have no impact on deer, that it's absolutely nothing. What we're saying is wolves are not the primary driver of it, that there are other things that are ultimately driving it. Wolves might have a role to an extent, but they are not the primary driver. And so a good example of how we think wolves might be having somewhat of an impact is they could be slowing population recovery, particularly after severe winters. So as I showed this graph before, wolf populations are following deer populations, or had been for quite a while. And then we had this severe winter, and all of a sudden we see deer start decreasing, but wolves stay at elevated levels. And the question is, how can wolves remain at elevated, high levels when deer populations sort of plummet? And the reason why is that wolf populations take a while to adjust to the change in deer population density. And that's because wolves come out of severe winters. Unlike deer, they come out of it in superb physical condition because they've had tons of deer to feast on, they have good fat reserves, and that's going to carry them a long way through the summer. And what happened, particularly in 22 and 23, is we had a very harsh winter. Then we had a summer. Wolves were in really good shape coming into that summer. And then all of a sudden, boom, we had another really harsh winter, which really hurt deer. So you sort of have this compounding effect. And what that likely does is allows wolves to stay at an elevated level. Predation pressure might be higher than it would have otherwise, and that probably slows deer population's ability to sort of recover quickly from this. But ultimately, this dynamic of wolves having an impact on deer appears really contingent on the winter conditions that facilitate that. So wolves are having an impact, but there's also that aspect of winter that's also driving that change as well. So then let's look at a really interesting association between wolves and deer hunting success in the GVE. Are these two sort of at odds with one another, or do they show similar patterns? So just to recap, we have already shown how hunter success generally increases with deer populations. And then we've also shown that, except for years in sort of really harsh winters, that wolf populations generally increase with deer populations. So what you note, or will notice here, is that hunter success and wolf populations are both driven by the same thing, and that's deer populations. So the thing that causes wolf populations to go up appears to cause hunter success to go up, and vice versa. So it ultimately isn't that surprising to us when wolf populations, or when we note that there's a positive correlation between hunter success and wolf population size. Now, we shared this graph last year, and people got very upset at us that we would even suggest that this trend could be occurring. But we have 10 years of data here that show this pretty clearly, that generally hunters are more successful when there's more wolves around, not because wolves are making better deer hunting, but because they're a symptom of better deer hunting, and vice versa. So, to summarize most of this, there's little evidence that wolves are to blame for the recent lower sort of hunting success that's occurring in northern Minnesota, and it's very likely to blame on winter conditions. So now we're going to then examine what impact will wolf hunting and trapping have on deer populations, deer hunting, and then also wolf populations. Well, fortunately, we have some data in Minnesota to really examine the relationship between these variables. So from 2012 to 2014, Minnesota had wolf hunting and trapping seasons. This is when wolves were off the endangered species list for a while. And so during those years, we can look at kind of how many wolves were killed, and then we can look at how that actually influenced hunting. So the first hunting season was in 2012 to 2013, and 413 wolves were killed. The next year was 2013 to 2014, and 238 wolves were killed. And then 2014 to 2015, 264 wolves were killed. Now, that's just the wolves that were killed for hunting and trapping seasons. We have to also factor in the wolves that were killed for depredations, for killing livestock and then being removed by government trappers. And so if we do that, we actually note that 628 wolves were killed in 2012 and 2013. That represents about 24% of the population. The following year, about 333 wolves were killed. That's 12% of the population. And then in 2014 to 2015, 436 wolves were killed, which is 16% of the population. So for a 3-year period, anywhere from 12 to 24% of the wolf population was being removed by people for hunting and trapping and depredations. So we can look at this. We can go back to this graph of deer hunter success rates in northern Minnesota. And this is, again, showing data from all deer permit areas in the Arrowhead region of Minnesota. And we can look at what effect these management actions on wolves had. So between 2012 and 2013, 628 wolves were killed, so 24% of the population. And what we see is a decline in deer hunter success rate by almost 8% or something like that. Then the following year, 333 wolves were killed, and we see an almost 10% decrease in deer hunter success rates. And then 436 wolves were killed the following year, and we see a slight increase. But in general, we see pretty substantial decreases in deer hunter success rates despite the addition of wolf hunting and trapping. And importantly, the lowest hunter success rate in the past 12 years occurred during the third year of wolf hunting and trapping. So it's very hard to make sense of these statistics if wolf hunting and trapping is supposed to ameliorate these negative effects of wolves on deer hunting and deer populations. Now, what's important to note as well is that despite this hunting and trapping season, Minnesota's wolf population actually remained fairly stable during these 3 hunting seasons. So the graph I have here is from the Minnesota DNR's 2023 wolf report, and the 3 years of the wolf hunt were right here. And when you look at it initially, it looks like the population is lower than it has been in recent years. But really, that's an artifact of when sampling is done. So wolf populations are measured in midwinter. Well, when you have a wolf hunting season in fall and early winter, you're going to remove a lot of wolves right away that aren't going to be counted for in this period of time. And so really, if we want to understand what the population would have been like without a hunting season, we have to add sort of back in those wolves that were removed to see where the population would have been. And when we do that, we see that there's basically a similar estimate as there has been. In other words, the reason that we have, or in other words, that wolf hunting season didn't really have a substantial impact on the wolf population. And indeed, there was a paper done by Chakrabarty et al., which looked at the trends in the survival and mortality of wolves in Minnesota for a very long period of time, including this hunting season. And what they conclude is that we did not observe evidence that survival was markedly reduced during years when a public harvest was allowed on wolves. In other words, what they're saying is that the population compensated for these losses. So instead of wolves dying maybe of natural causes, they actually died of human-caused mortality. But nonetheless, when you sort of look at it across the population, there wasn't any change in overall survival. And if you don't have any change in overall survival, you're not going to see population change from those actions either. So the data from Minnesota seems to indicate that a wolf hunting and trapping season is not going to do a lot to increase or change deer hunting. But we can look at this another really interesting way as well. We're in a sort of a unique scenario in the greater Voyageurs ecosystem where in our area in Minnesota, there's no legal hunting and trapping of wolves. But just across the border, literally, a couple kilometers across the border, there's wolf hunting and trapping in Canada, in Ontario. And about 10% of all the wolves that we've collared on our project have ended up being hunted or trapped in Canada. So there's a fair number of wolves from our area that go over there and then are harvested. Now, what's interesting about Canada is, and Ontario, I should say, is that like Minnesota, they have these permit areas and they record data the same way Minnesota does in terms of the number of hunters and the number of deer that are harvested in these permit areas. And so what we decided to do was actually look at what were the harvest rates of deer in these permit areas that in theory have a habitat and habitat management very similar to the greater Voyageurs ecosystem, and that in theory have very similar winters, similar prey communities for wolves, and similar, in theory, wolf densities. It is hard to know exactly what hunting and trapping pressure is in this area, but there are several people who maintain trap lines. We had a trapper that I talked to last year who by January of last year had already trapped 22 wolves, he said. And the year before that, he said he had trapped 31. We know there's wolf hunting outposts that are in this area as well. So there is active people actively hunting and trapping wolves. So in theory, if these management actions are beneficial for deer hunting, we should be able to see that in the data. So this is what happens when you, or this is what you find when you look at the deer hunter success rates in the GVE and surrounding areas. That's what we call north central Minnesota, and then in that area right across the border in Ontario. So what this is showing is hunter success rates in these two areas. And what you notice is a really uncanny similarity between hunter success rates in Ontario, right across the border, and in north central Minnesota. And what's particularly uncanny is that they follow similar trends. That is, one goes up, the other goes up, and vice versa. And so, despite there being wolf management, there doesn't really seem to be much of a difference in terms of deer hunter success rates. Um, and the reason that we think this is also really interesting is that it seems to suggest that there's some factor that's impacting deer hunting in both Ontario and Minnesota in similar ways. And that's what's causing these changes in success through time. And we would obviously say that winters seem like they would fit that bill pretty well. But when we look at just sort of overall hunter success rates in these areas of Ontario and the greater Voyageurs ecosystem over the past 12 years, what we see is that the average hunter in the GVE has harvested 0.224 deer. The average hunter in Canada and Ontario is 0.226 deer per hunter. So these two are almost identical. So despite changes or very different approaches to wolf management, they have very similar deer hunting outcomes. So then, why doesn't wolf hunting and trapping do anything for deer? Well, it's probably as clear. It doesn't seem that wolves are really the primary factor driving deer population change. So if you don't influence the primary factor that's causing deer populations to change, you're not going to change deer hunting success by killing wolves. Now, let's say you think that I'm just absolutely full of it and that the winters are a terrible thing, that's not, or a terrible explanation, that it's got to be the wolves. Well, even if that were the case, even if we could say conclusively that wolves are the primary factor, wolf populations are really resilient to hunting and trapping. And so, even if they were impacting the deer, somehow you have to reduce wolf populations to actually lead, you would have to then reduce them to lead to any change in deer populations. And so then the question is, well, how many wolves would you have to reduce and why are wolves resilient? And that's what I kind of want to get into here next. So the reason why wolves are resilient to hunting and trapping is because the number of wolves on the landscape is ultimately driven by the amount of prey on the landscape. As I talked about earlier, as you have more prey, you have more wolves. And so if you hunt and kill wolves or trap wolves and reduce the wolf population below the natural carrying capacity, that population is going to keep trying to bounce up back to that carrying capacity because that's how much food there is on the landscape and that's how many wolves can be supported in a naturally sort of occurring landscape. And so what killing wolves does is just knocks the population down temporarily below that carrying capacity, but then wolves are able to compensate for that very quickly via all sorts of mechanisms, including increased reproduction, increased pup survival, delayed dispersal. And the reason why this is the case is because when you remove wolves below that carrying capacity, you now leave a lot more food on average for the surviving wolves, which means those wolves are in better condition, means that some wolves might not leave the area because there's more food now for them in that system. So you alter some aspects of how that population might function, which allows that population to compensate for that loss from hunting and trapping. So I made this really terrible illustration here to try to illustrate this point and hopefully a way that kind of makes sense. So let's assume that this dotted line here is the natural carrying capacity. So that's the amount of wolves that a landscape could support based on the amount of prey that's available. So let's assume that without a deer or without a wolf hunting season, we sort of have these natural fluctuations where that wolf population sometimes is a little above carrying capacity, a little bit below, but it kind of fluctuates around it. Then let's say we implement a hunting and trapping season. What's going to happen is that right away, as you implement that, you get into hunting season, you're going to remove a lot of wolves pretty quickly. But then that population is going to want to compensate for that very quickly and going to want to bounce back up to that natural carrying capacity because there's enough food to support that many wolves. And then you can sort of knock them down again temporarily, but then it's going to pop back up. And it's going to keep generally doing this as long as you do these sort of things. And then if you got rid of that season, it would sort of fluctuate back to sort of the way it would naturally. Now, this is sort of an exaggeration of how this would work just to illustrate a point, but it is sort of this premise where you're reducing the population and then it's just bouncing back up after it's sort of able to compensate for those things. So pretty much the way you can reduce wolf populations is by killing a lot of wolves. And if you really want to sort of induce a population decline, you have to kill a lot of wolves to overcome wolves' ability to compensate for losses to hunting and trapping. And we're going to look at here a couple examples that illustrate this well. So I want to start by this excerpt by Dave Meach, who's one of the sort of world's foremost wolf biologists. In 2017, he wrote a peer-reviewed article, and this is what he had to say about some states that were trying to reduce their wolf populations. He says the states, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, where wolves were delisted, allowed regulated public wolf harvesting. Some states tried to reduce their wolf populations through public take. However, most took fewer wolves than the annual increment from reproduction, so some even liberalized their regulations. Still, as anticipated, the states found it very difficult to reduce their wolf populations. Montana's population of at least 497 wolves in 2008, for example, included at least 536 in 2018 after 8 years of increasingly liberal harvest regulations. So basically, these states tried to get rid of wolves, and it didn't do a whole lot, or not get rid of them, but to reduce the population sizes, and it wasn't very effective. And what's interesting is in 2025, there's been a lot of headlines about Montana and their wolf management strategies recently, because after 14 years of sort of wolf hunting and trapping, they're still unhappy because they've not been able to really, or some people aren't unhappy because they're not able to put a dent really in the wolf population. And so these are just a few headlines that recently came out talking about some bills that have been introduced to try to increase the number of wolves that will be killed to try to reduce the wolf population. And I think this is a quote from a news article, and the Montana Trappers Association sort of summarized it well in one of their statements where they said, these bills are a product of the inability of the state to reduce the population of wolves as directed by HB 314 in 2023. So in essence, despite the hunting and trapping, wolves still remained at relatively stable levels. And if you read Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks' recent wolf management report, what they actually did is they looked at sort of how many wolves need to be removed or what percent of the population needs to be removed to actually cause population declines. And what they concluded is that they need a human caused mortality rate of 27% or more than 27% to cause declines. Mortality rate of 27%, most of which would come from hunting and trapping, would result in a stable population, so it wouldn't change through time. So that's in essence saying you could kill one in every about 4 wolves in the state annually, and you're still not going to change the level or the number of wolves in that state year over year. And this isn't too dissimilar from other scientific work that's been done. So in a while back, there was a study done called that was looking at exactly how many wolves could you remove, or what percent could you remove, and what impact would that have on wolf population dynamics. And so there's this large meta-analysis that was done. And what they concluded in that meta-analysis is that you need to kill 22 to 25% of wolf populations to initiate population declines. That was actually lower than other studies that exist out there that suggest that might even be closer to 30%. So the point being that obviously there's a lot of wolves you have to remove if you want to cause that population to start going down. And one of probably a good example of an attempt to reduce wolf populations is if we look at Idaho and look at the sort of efforts they've made to try to reduce their populations. So they've tried for a while to reduce their populations, and they've really not had much effect until just very recently. In 2021, because they weren't having much effect, there were more liberalized harvests, and basically you could have an unlimited harvest of wolves by pretty much any means that you could think of. I mean, not literally everything, but a lot of things you could use to remove wolves. And one of those things, for example, included a reimbursement for killing wolves, which is essentially sort of a bounty for killing wolves. So they instituted these sort of measures to try to reduce wolf populations. And so we can look at what that impact that actually had. So in 2023, in Idaho's Gray Wolf Management Plan, they first talk about the challenges that they had had in trying to reduce the population. So it says in 2019 to 2021, 516 wolves died annually, a mortality rate of approximately 33%, yet annual reproduction during those years appeared to have replaced mortality, resulting in a stable population. So despite killing uh, a couple thousand wolves over the course of a couple years, it really didn't have much impact on the population. So they go on to conclude that to reduce wolf populations, wolf mortality may need to be increased to 37% of the population annually for 6 years to get it where they want it to be. And that's about where, per the sort of information I've read, that where the harvest levels have been the past couple of years, or at least human-caused mortality levels have been. And so they're starting to just see some declines in the population after those very high levels of harvest. And here's a graph that I found in it's not available in a report, but it was in a presentation that was recorded online where they were showing some of their population size estimates from Idaho. And the two dots, they were really talking here about differences in population monitoring approaches. But the point here to show is just that from 2017 to 2021, even though they're killing 500 wolves or 400 and some wolves, the population remained pretty stable. And then it's only after they started removing somewhere around 37, 40% of the population that you start to see some declines, and even these aren't very substantial declines. So the reason that I share all of these examples is really to illustrate that it's pretty clear that to reduce wolf populations, you have to remove a lot of wolves and do so pretty aggressively. So then what does that mean about wolf management in Minnesota and whether or not, what's going to happen with wolves in Minnesota? There's been a lot of things in the news about wolves possibly being delisted under the new administration, and then management going back to the states. Obviously, it's unclear how that's all going to play out, but if that were to occur, what would it look like in Minnesota? Well, the best place to go to is to look at Minnesota's wolf management plan, which we had no involvement in. But you can go online, and you can look up the management plan, which is meant to go from 2023 to 2032. And in this management plan, the state says that part of their goals are to maintain a well-connected and resilient wolf population, maintain a population comparable to recent estimates. And right now, the state's estimates are about 2,900, I think, was the most recent estimate. And they state that if there's a wolf harvest season, which isn't a guarantee under the plan, they said it's an option, but if there is one, it will not cause long-term statewide population decline. So, in other words, if there were to be a hunting and trapping season, it would remove only enough wolves that would allow there to be a season, but it wouldn't change, it seems, overall population levels. And then they outline what percent of the population could, in theory, be harvested if there were a hunting and trapping season. And you'll note that right now the population is 2,900 wolves in this sort of 22 to 3,000 range, which they call stable. And they note that the harvest level would be somewhere between 10 to 20% during that time. And based on everything that we just were talking about, that level is not going to be sufficient to really change wolf population numbers in any meaningful way, which is probably why that ended up being the rate that they chose there, because that fits in with the goal to maintain a population comparable to recent estimates. So, based on Minnesota's management plan and what we know about hunting and trapping of wolves and how many you have to remove to actually induce population declines, wolf management will likely do little to change wolf deer population dynamics in the greater Voyageurs ecosystem or other parts of Minnesota. Um, in part because, like I said earlier, winters more than wolves are really driving those changes. And even if it wasn't winters, even if it was wolves exclusively, the wolf management approaches outlined in the management plan aren't going to really impact wolf numbers. And so if they're not going to impact the numbers, they're really not going to have an impact on prey populations. So because of that, the way we would really liken sort of like a hunting and trapping season to help deer is sort of the equivalent of like squeezing a stress ball. The reason we make that analogy is it might make some folks feel like they're having an impact by removing a wolf, but it ultimately doesn't change anything because in the end, it's not going to really change wolf deer dynamics. It's not going to really change wolf numbers, and it's not going to really change deer numbers. Now, like I said at the beginning, all of this is not intended in any way, shape, or form to be a statement on wolf hunting and trapping, whether we should have one or shouldn't have one in Minnesota, should wolves be delisted, and it certainly isn't a comment on federal delisting. What the goal here was really to say, to take a look at what the data, what the science actually indicates. And so in these kinds of discussions, unfortunately, how you interpret the data or the patterns is deemed often an advocacy position. So if you say wolves are not having an impact on deer, that means you're trying to save the wolves or you're against wolf management. Or if you say, I know wolves can be harvested sustainably, therefore you're in favor of a wolf hunting season. And those aren't necessarily true. Oftentimes there's factual statements that are scientific statements, but those are not values-based statements. And the reason that that distinction is important is that both sort of sides in the wolf discussion, those who might want more aggressive wolf management and those who don't really want any, both say that the science supports their perspective. And obviously, that can't possibly be true. The science can't simultaneously say that we shouldn't kill any wolves and we should kill a lot of wolves. And ultimately, the reality is that the science doesn't support either one of those sides. The science is sort of has nothing to say regarding what we should do in terms of wolf management. And so that's why it's very important to sort of make sure when we're in this discussion to sort of parse out where science ends and where values begin. So, for example, we could look at what the science actually says. And what the science indicates is wolves can be hunted and trapped sustainably. I just can't see how you could reach a conclusion other than that given the data. It also says that hunting and trapping seasons, given the levels that are proposed in the management plan, would have little to no impact on wolf populations in Minnesota. It also indicates that if left alone, wolf populations would regulate themselves based on prey abundance. They would sort of just naturally find the level that the landscape can support. It also indicates that wolf hunting and trapping, unless done at high levels, will do little to decrease wolf populations. And hunting and trapping of wolves will do little to increase deer populations and thereby deer hunting success. And so some of these aspects support some people's perspectives and some of it supports other people's perspectives. And so, in reality, all of these facts, all of this information doesn't tell us what we should do. It just tells us how the natural world works and what impact our actions may or may not have on the way the natural world works. And ultimately, what we really need to be focused on is values, because the science can inform our values, but it doesn't tell us what we should do. And ultimately, management decisions are driven by values. And so we think wolf management like the management and conservation of all natural resources, should ultimately reflect what society values and wants. In a democratic nation state, ultimately the natural resources are held in the public trust for the public. And those actions or whatever is done with those resources should reflect what people want for those resources. And those are values based, not scientific based. And with that, I'm going to wrap up here. And I want to just give a big thanks to the more than 8,700 private donors who've supported our project to date, and acknowledge several other organizations such as the Minnesota Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, University of Minnesota, International Wolf Center, Van Soon Foundation, and many others who've made our project possible. And with that, I will take questions that folks have, and I would imagine there's probably going to be quite a few of them. Okay. Um, so I'm just going to start going through these in line here and trying to answer them to the best of my abilities. So the first one was, how many acres is the Greater Voyageurs ecosystem? I have no idea. We don't really generally work in acres, so I don't know. It's 2,300 square kilometers. So if you want to crunch those numbers, you can get that estimate. Oh, I should also note, make sure you're putting your questions in the Q&A function, not in the chat. Okay, so this one says, can you discuss a bit about the moose population? It seems in the GV it was very low, and then all of a sudden it seems it's growing. What's your take on why and whether this is true? So it does seem from particularly our trail camera data that we're seeing more and more moose on our cameras in the past couple of years than we did before that. We're always wary when it comes to trail cameras to say how much that is a representative sample of population change. Given the increase we have seen sort of anecdotally, it does seem hard to imagine how we could see all those moose all of a sudden if there weren't more. But without looking at that more rigorously, we'd say it seems like there's an increase, but how much it's hard to say. And then what the cause of that is also really hard to say at this point. And maybe down the line we'll be able to look at that in more detail, but I don't want to speculate any more than that until we have better data to understand those changes and if there is even substantial change occurring. Okay, so during or following severe winters, deer populations drop. Wolves would then need to switch their primary food source. With recovery objectives of moose and elk in Minnesota difficult to achieve, would you hypothesize the wolf populations would remain stable as they feed on these alternative food source? Um, Make sure I understand this correctly. During or following severe winter. Okay, so I think the question's asking, like, would wolves go to eat something else if deer populations are declining? And in our area, one of the reasons why wolf populations probably remain elevated in part from after these very severe winters is because like in the winter, they might sort of have a killing eating deer, because even as deer density goes down in the winter, because deer are so vulnerable in these severe winters, wolves are still able to kill deer that they otherwise might not be able to. So you might have sort of intensive predation during those harsh winters. And then when those winters end, one of the things in the greater Voyageurs ecosystem is we have a really dense beaver population. And while sometimes people think it's humorous to be like, oh, the wolves just eat beavers or whatever, in our system, there's a lot of wolves that do rely predominantly on beavers to get through the summer. Some breeding individuals, those are the ones primarily provisioning pups, are sometimes 80% of the prey biomass that they're acquiring over a 7-month period of time are beavers. And so wolves can come out of that winter, deer populations can be depressed, and wolves can switch to another food source for a good chunk of the time that is abundant and has remained abundant for a long time, and then they enter another winter. And so there is some switching to other food sources, undoubtedly, that can probably explain why you can see wolves remaining at these elevated levels. But then as time goes on, if deer populations don't rebound and you don't have, let's say, really extreme severe winters consecutively back to back to back, sooner or later there's going to be mild winters where all of a sudden wolves are not able to catch deer very efficiently, like we saw in 2024. And what we saw this past year is wolf populations declined by 15% in our area. And that decline was driven almost entirely by increases in territory size. And this is a well documented sort of phenomenon that as prey density decreases, wolf territory size starts to increase because wolves have to start searching a wider area to find enough vulnerable prey to keep living. And so, as wolf territory size increases, that means there can be fewer packs in an area, which then decreases population density. So, I hope that answers that question. I kind of looked at it from a couple different angles. Okay, the next question. Why did wolves have lower kill rates during the mild 2023-2024 winter? Were the deer healthier, better able to escape? Yes, that's exactly what it seems like. Deer, wolves just couldn't find vulnerable deer. There was very little that would impede deer's ability to escape. There's very little snow. Deer were able to access vegetation. And in particular, what's very important is how long winters last. And so the winters that are severe often last. We have deep snow into late March and into often late April and sometimes early May. That was the case in 2022 and 2023. Last year, we were snow free, with the exception of a snowstorm that came briefly in like early March, right? And so that means that deer are not expending a lot of energy to move around when they're already sort of nutritionally stressed. So in those mild winters, those deer are in a lot better shape. In those bad winters, deer have, get to April, they have depleted their energy reserves, and now they still have to trudge around in deep snow, and wolves have no problem catching a lot of really sort of debilitated deer during that time. Okay, another question is, what role do the different targeted prey animals have in their impact to this study, if any? My understanding is that wolves tend to target the young, ill, old, while hunters generally aim for animals in or near their primes. Um, that can be true. The one challenge we have with particularly wolf predation on deer in determining what prey wolves are targeting is that, particularly last year, and it's also been the case this winter as we've continued our predation work, is that wolves eat almost everything of the deer they're killing when it's not a harsh winter. And oftentimes, when a pack feeds on a deer, they start eating, and then different pack members start taking the head somewhere and the legs somewhere and things like that. And so, oftentimes, we can't find the information that we need to actually determine what age was it, what sex was it, and so forth. So, it's really hard to say, what wolves or sorry, what deer wolves were targeting during that time because we just don't have a large enough sample size to actually assess that. There are other areas where that has been shown to be the case, that hunters will aim for animals near their prime typically. Um, but that could be highly variable depending on different hunting regulations and things like that. Have you studied pack persistence of wolves after human-caused mortality? So we did look at we are on a study in that came out. This was 2 years ago. That was a study looking at wolves in a variety of national parks: Yellowstone, Grand Teton, Yukon Charlie, Denali, and then Voyageurs. And what that found is that when wolves lose a pack member to some sort of human-caused mortality, the pack does appear to have a reduced chance of persisting, and that sort of impact is larger if it's a breeding animal. But what's really important to note there is that in that particular study, we only quantified what happened to that particular social group. So it wasn't examining whether or not, there was a pack here, they lost a breeding male, and then the pack, fell apart and another pack took over. It was just saying what happens to those specific group of individuals once they lose a breeding animal. What typically appears to happen is that when breeding individuals in particular die, packs might dissolve, but that vacancy that's there for territories is quickly filled in. And so while that individual pack might not persist, quote unquote, a pack will be in that environment almost all the time. We've only had one instance in 10 years where we had a territory that we thought was not occupied in the winter by wolves. And that we don't know what that was a result of necessarily. So at least in our area, um, when packs sort of dissolve, which happens a lot for natural reasons, breeding individuals get killed by other wolves, they get diseased, all sorts of things. Other packs are really quick, or other wolves are quick to fill those openings that are there. Because you have to remember that in any wolf population, at least in Minnesota typically, you're going to have somewhere between 15 to 20% of that population are going to be lone wolves that are kind of wandering about. And so when vacancies are open, you have these wolves that are that are roaming a lot and can quickly find these openings and take advantage of them and fill them. Okay. Dave asks, have hunter success rates improved in Idaho since they ramped up their wolf population reduction efforts? I'm guessing it is not, since it's all about winter weather. I don't know enough about all of their data. I have seen graphs that have looked at hunter success rates for Montana and Idaho, and they compare those to hunter success rates in Utah and Colorado, some other western states, to look at how, the presence of wolves has impacted hunter success rates through time. And basically what they found, at least those graphs purported to show, is that hunter success rates of elk in Montana and Idaho are actually look a little better than those in Utah and Colorado. And actually, there's a slight increase in hunter success rates in Idaho and Montana, whereas you don't see that so much in Utah and Colorado. So it doesn't appear that those wolf management actions are really having much of an impact on hunter success rates. But like I said, that's just based on sort of a cursory overview of that. And before saying I know that for certain, would want to get into that data a bit more detail. The next question, in 2024, mild winter, wolves showed signs of weight loss. Is that because prey were more capable of avoiding wolves? Okay, so I already answered that one. Oh, wait, no, that one says we're more capable of avoiding predation due to the mild winter, or because deer populations were down from the 2022-2023 hard winters. So they're basically saying is, did they not get a lot of wolves because there weren't a lot of deer around, or because of the winter conditions? And obviously, those are something that's difficult to assess. But it seems very likely it's a lot more due to deer vulnerability than it is the number of deer on the landscape. Because, like I said, we could see that wolf packs had increased territory size by about 20%, meaning that they were doing that to sort of have a territory that had more deer in it because deer abundance or deer density had decreased. And so it seems more likely that it's not has less to do with the reduced deer densities, and more to do with winter conditions. The next question, did the years with hunting and trapping affect pack stability? So, like I said, hunting and trapping probably will have some impacts on pack stability. If a breeding individual is killed via hunting or trapping, that probably has a decent probability of causing some disruption in that pack. Not always, but sometimes. And so this is one of those things that while hunting and trapping might not change overall population size, it might change certain aspects of how that population functions and then how social groups function. And whether or not that's an important thing when considering certain wolf management actions is ultimately a values-based question. Whether or not it matters if you disrupt social groups or not is something that comes down to your sort of how you think about the issue and whether you think about packs or you think about populations or individuals. Did the years with hunting and oh, so then it says, does hunting trapping affect their hunting skills, choices of prey, or their ability to bounce back after a mild winter with bad hunting? Um, that is very hard to say. I haven't seen any data to sort of associate wolf management with wolves' ability to hunt and kill prey, so I don't really know. Um, the next question is, if taking 10 to 20% of the wolves annually won't reduce the population, wouldn't it make sense to allow a season, when delisted, to allow harvest opportunity as well as raise dollars for wolf management or abatement? This is an example of a good question that comes down to values. And as from a purely scientific standpoint, there's really no right or wrong. There's no yes or no answer to that question. It really comes down to what you value. If you value, let's say, like you mentioned here, having this opportunity, raising money for different natural resource things, then you would say that makes a lot of sense. If your perspective is that I don't like any wolves being killed, I want the population to regulate itself naturally, you're going to say that doesn't. I'm not advocating for either one of those positions. I'm simply stating that a lot of folks from their perspective think that things like that make sense, and there's people on the other side who think their perspective makes sense, and that ultimately is informed by those people's values. And so, just looking at it from a scientific, objective perspective, there's no way that you can really make a determination of what is truly the best way forward. And so that's why we said that what management should reflect should be what people want. Do they think that is, does society as a whole think that is the best option, given all of the options available or not? And we can't answer that question. Is chronic wasting disease an issue in the Voyageurs area? Does CWD affect the harvesting numbers, human or wolf? Is that being considered when the state is calculating hunter success? Feel free to expand upon CWD or deer populations and its spread. In the end, we don't have CWD in Voyageurs, and hopefully it stays that way. There's a lot of uncertainty about knowing what role there is between wolves, deer, and CWD. Some folks say that wolves or suggest that wolves are going to sort of somehow keep CWD at bay. I just don't think people really know necessarily whether or not that's the case. And part of the challenge there too is, let's say CWD was present up here. Um, Unless there's becomes easier ways to test for whether a deer has CWD based on small remains of tissue or marrow or things like that, it's going to be very hard for us when we go to a kill, given how little is left, to determine whether or not a deer was diseased at all. And so if you can't determine that, it's very difficult to know how wolves may or may not be, let's say, selecting diseased deer or not doing that. So there's just a lot of questions when it comes to CWD that I don't think we really know the answers of right now. And frankly, I hope we don't have to look into that question in the future, because I don't think that would be good for deer in the area. Okay, Carolyn asked, did the Minnesota hunting and trapping seasons reduce depredations? Is that why the number of wolves killed dropped after the first hunting season? The number of wolves that dropped after that first hunting season was because they changed the harvest quota. It's hard with 3 years of data to really notice a substantial change. There were still plenty of depredations during that time. There were fluctuations that were ongoing. I don't have that data off the top of my head, but it's a challenging thing to look at those associations on 3 years of data and draw any conclusions. But I think you can say pretty safely that hunting and trapping seasons are not going to put a substantial reduction in depredations or the money needed to actually resolve depredations. I was on the phone several months ago with a biologist from Manitoba, where they have hunting and trapping seasons, and he was telling me they have all sorts of issues with livestock that they're trying to resolve, and he keeps trying to tell folks, like, we can't kill our way out of this problem, because no matter what we do, we still end up having these issues. And so I suspect that that is not dissimilar here. And even the states, Montana and Idaho, are still paying tens of thousands of dollars to deal with wolf depredation issues despite their hunting and trapping season. So it doesn't mean that you couldn't, in theory, kill enough wolves to reduce the number of depredations, but you're not going to do it by reducing a small proportion of the population, again, because you're not really changing the total number of wolves on the landscape. So you're still going to have the same number of potential issues. Next question. With 2 mild winters and the wolf population as is, do you expect the deer population to increase? I have personally not seen an increase in the deer population in the study area. It's really going to depend on what this winter ends up looking like. If the winter ends early, I suspect we're going to see that population trajectory continue. It seems like from, anecdotally, it looks like wolf populations in the area probably are going to decrease again this winter. It looks like territories have also continued to get bigger through time, likely as they're adjusting to the change in deer density. So far, the winter's been very mild. Now, like I said, the impact of winters, though, really is how long and how deep of snow we have. So right now it might be mild, but if we get several large snowstorms and then that lasts until the end of April, that could change what this winter's like, and that could be a very different outcome for deer. So it really just depends on what things look like. But all evidence seems to indicate that if there's another mild winter, deer should have a good spring and then a good summer. And like I said, under the right conditions, deer are a very prolific species, just like wolves can be. So they can reproduce fairly quickly. The problem is, it's kind of like when you look at interest that accrues on investment. When that investment has a very large principal and you make 10%, what you get in interest is a very large amount. But when that principal is very small, even if you make 10%, it still doesn't look like that much because the sort of interest you gained isn't that much because your principal isn't that much. So the deer population could be increasing, but since it's at such a low density, it's very hard to detect that increase because the principal, quote unquote, is so small. Whereas when the population is much bigger, you will have a lot more deer on the landscape each year that it's sort of mild. Can you put up the sponsor slide again? Um, Let me see here. There's the sponsor slide. And I'll leave that up for a second. Janet says, great presentation. Thank you, Janet. Gordon says, is the wolf density number being considered average in relation to the Great Lakes area or across the U.S., aka does it include the Rockies? I'm not sure what that is referring to in terms of the wolf density number being considered average. Um, yeah, I'm not sure what that is referring to in that instance. Next question. I know this talk was specifically discussing wolves and deer, but I'm curious about how wolf populations impact the ecosystem overall. Well, that's a big question, and there are roles that wolves play functionally in the ecosystem. We've demonstrated several of this with our studies on wolf predation on beavers. Um, where we've been able to show that wolves, by preying on beavers, influence forest structure by limiting how far from water beavers are willing to travel to forage, and then also wetland creation and formation. Because wolves will kill beavers that are forming new wetlands, and that prevents those wetlands from forming in those areas. So, and when you look at that across an ecosystem of ours, it shows that wolves are having an impact, but that impact isn't substantial. It's not like wolves, there's nothing that I've seen to indicate that wolves are radically sort of restructuring the whole landscape like you sometimes hear that wolves do. Instead, wolves are a small part of a very large and complex ecosystem, and they're connected to a lot of ecological processes, as are many other species. And so, they certainly play a role as an apex predator in that regard, but they also aren't, let's say, the savior of the Voyageurs ecosystem. They're just another one of many animals that plays an important role. Okay. I'm going to move forward here. Okay. Next question is, how do you count wolf populations in the GV compared to the way that they're measured in the rest of the state? And do you think the method for the rest of the state is accurate? So that's a good question. So I'll start with how we do it. And notice, and importantly, estimating wolf populations in a smaller area is generally a lot simpler than in a large area. So the way that we do it is we have GPS collars out. So we put those out. We try to keep about anywhere between 8 to 10 packs collared at a given time, which allows us to know where territories generally are and also to know what territory size is. And then we have about 350 trail cameras spread across the 23 to 24 packs in our area to try to get as much footage of wolves in these various packs during the winter so we know how many wolves are in each one of those packs. And on average, I'm trying to remember what it was last year, but I think we got somewhere between, I want to say, I think 20 independent observations of the packs of each pack in our area throughout the winter time. So we have really good confidence in the number of wolves in each pack. We often know all of the individuals in that pack. We know what they look like. And that's largely coming from trail cameras. So we want to have a really high degree of confidence in pack size and then obviously territory size. Because if you know pack size and you know territory size, you can then look at our study area and you can say, okay, this is how many packs could fit in this area, and this is the number of packs or the number of wolves in each pack, and you can get an estimate. That's a really quick overview. If you go to our website and voyagerswolfproject.org, we have a section that says reports. And if you go to our most recent report, it'll detail out It's about a 60-page report, and all of it is just summarizing what we know about the packs we study, as well as the information and data we've collected, and it will walk through all of our methods. But our goal is to know how many wolves in our area with a high degree of certainty, because those are obviously very important. We're putting in a lot of work to understand these relationships, and that's a very key important metric for us. Now, in terms of the states method, um, I think the states method has, in principle, is a pretty seems like a pretty fair approach. It's very similar to how we do ours in terms of determine the average territory size, determine average pack size, and then try to determine what range or what area wolves occupy in that area. Um, However, there are some difficulties when you're looking at a place as large as Minnesota, because there are some areas that might not be occupied by wolves. You're not going to have, perfect knowledge. So they try to delineate wolf range in the state. So it's very hard to know without, other methods to know exactly where it is. But I do think when you look at the average territory in the state, you look at the average pack size, and I'm saying long term, and then you look at the average wolf range, their estimates are probably somewhere pretty close to the ballpark. Usually their estimates are like 2,900, and then they have confidence intervals that I believe are like plus or minus 4 to 500 wolves, meaning that the true estimate could be between, 35 or 2,500 and 3,500 or something like that. And when you look at just wolf biology, you know that wolves generally are not sharing territories, at least not substantial proportions of their territories. And so that quickly allows you to kind of calculate out, well, how many wolf territories in theory could fit in wolf range in Minnesota? And so sometimes you hear estimates that there's 6,000 wolves, 10,000 wolves, etc. But to get those estimates would require there to be something about wolves in the rest of Minnesota that have the tiniest territories or really abnormally large packs that are not being detected by the DNR. And I just don't think that's the case. Um, I think they're pretty darn, like they're pretty close, and by close I mean in the ballpark. I don't think the DNR would say we know for certain there's this many to the wolf, but they would say this is roughly speaking where we're probably at. And I think they're probably pretty close in that regard, just based on what we know about how wolves set up territories and how populations function. Next question. Do the specific wolves targeted for hunting and trapping have an impact on pack formation of survivability? Um, Potentially, probably a lot of wolves that are killed during hunting and trapping seasons. You have often primarily really young wolves. So these are going to be pups that are naive. Also, lone wolves are often at a much higher rate of mortality because they're traveling around landscapes they're not familiar with. And sometimes can make riskier decisions. And so, most of the wolves, for instance, that we've had, like going to Canada, that are then killed by hunters and trappers, are lone wolves that have sort of wandered across the border and are sort of moving around nomadically when they're removed. And there's a lot of work to indicate that lone wolves have much higher mortality rates than pack animals. So some wolves are almost always going to be targeted, not targeted, but going to be selectively removed just because of the way these work. And probably older adult individuals are probably going to be less susceptible to those things in general. Next question. I know this isn't your geographic region, but has there been research done following the recent Wisconsin wolf season in regards to their wolf population, deer population, hunter success? Um, I know there have been several scientific papers looking at the hunting season in Wisconsin, and for folks who might not be familiar, this is where I think it was 2 years ago, if I remember correctly, where they had a hunt, and in like 2 or 3 days or something like that, they killed like 200 and some wolves, and that I would say is sort of categorically in its own um, sort of situation, because most hunting and trapping seasons start in the fall. That's when there's a lot of hunting. When people are deer hunting, they might also have a tag and kill a wolf or something like that. Um, and then that will kind of drag through the rest of the year. In Wisconsin's, I believe that was at the end of February or sometime in February. And the reason why that it was sort of so unique is that you killed a ton of animals shortly after the breeding season had basically concluded, meaning that a lot of animals, there was no ability for that population to quickly compensate for those losses because you just took out all the reproductive prime. It'd be kind of like if you went deer hunting and shot a bunch of the does right before they're about to give birth to fawns. that's going to have a pretty sizable impact on the population. And that's not typically how most wolf hunting and trapping seasons are. So I'm hesitant to make any larger conclusions about that because it's just so different than most of the hunting and trapping seasons that exist. Would you say wolves also limit the upper boundary of deer populations rather than driving increases and declines? That is a question that people have wondered is whether or not wolves are a limiting factor. Um, that is very hard to say, but obviously there are areas I would probably lean towards. I don't necessarily think so, but it's possible. We can't rule it out. But when we look at like what deer populations are in our area, which in the past decade have maxed out at about 4 to 4.5 deer per square kilometer, we know that there's wolves or deer living in wolf range in areas where deer densities are much higher than that, and there's still substantial, robust wolf populations in those areas. So clearly, like in our area, it's hard to um, I don't know if it makes the most sense that wolves are the limiting factor because we can go to other spots in Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, where there's far more deer and wolves there as well. So, but it's also a possibility, and maybe as we do more work, like we'll find out a better answer. I mean, obviously, as we do more work, we learn more, we see more of the variability that can exist in different weather conditions and things like that, and that allows us to learn a lot more. Will you discuss how the wolf birth rate is self-adjusted? Is this through more mating pairs or female fertility, as with our coyote population? Well, one possible way could be, let's say you have a hunting and trapping season. Well, first of all, let's start with the idea that wolf populations naturally will sort of set a level that is consistent with prey populations. And that means that each wolf is getting a sufficient number of food for the population to kind of remain relatively stable. Now, let's say all of a sudden you remove a bunch of wolves. Now you have an sort of an abundance of food for the remaining wolves. And the number of pups that breeding females are going to have generally is going to be a reflection of what kind of condition that female is going to be in. And same thing can be true of things like deer. When the females are in good condition, they're more likely to have twins and vice versa. So if all of a sudden you now have these wolves that were kind of at normal carrying capacity and now they have a lot of food, it might increase their abilities to have more pups. And then if there's more food, that also might increase pup survival because there's more food to keep those pups to adulthood, and that allows the population to quickly rebound. So that's generally speaking how that could work if you're sort of removing wolf populations. Do the wolves harm the beaver population? Oh, I don't know what happened there. Let's see here. Okay. Um, can everyone still hear me all right? I don't know why that did that. Hopefully, yes. Okay. So this next question is, do the wolves harm the beaver population? We've seen absolutely no evidence that wolves harm the beaver population. And actually, this is a great question because it fits well with what we're saying about how humans are impacting wolf populations, and saying that like humans have to kill a lot of wolves to reduce wolf populations. The same is true of beavers, and beaver populations actually are very similar the way they operate to wolf populations, where you have sort of each beaver colony or lodge is a family group with breeding individuals, excuse me, and their offspring. And beaver populations are able to withstand very high levels of removal. The estimate is that beavers, depending on the study, can probably withstand 25 to 33% of the population being removed before they start declining, which obviously is kind of similar to what wolves are as well. And so in our area, even though wolves eat a lot of beavers, because the beaver population is so dense, wolves simply cannot kill even close to enough beavers to instantiate any sort of population decline. I mean, even if we took the best beaver killer wolf that we've studied and assumed every wolf was like that, they still wouldn't kill enough beavers to have an impact, which is why the Greater Voyageurs ecosystem has sustained really high beaver densities since the 1980s, 1990s, and there's no indication that that's going to change and that wolves are going to have any impact on that. Okay. Another question is, one of your studies found a single wolf killed, I believe, 35 or 36 fawns in a single season, and the average was around 5 or 6 fawns. We hear all the time wolves kill about 18 to 22 deer a year based on adult size. It would seem that the number of fawns killed by wolves may be a big factor in depressing deer populations already reduced by severe winters in northern regions. So there's a couple of things to note here. The first is that number of that we hear, the average wolf kills the equivalent of 20 adult deer a year, 18 to 22 deer a year. That number to me is when you really go back to where that number comes from, that is on very, very shaky ground. And it came from a study in the 1970s that sort of speculated, guesstimated that that was right, and then that's sort of been fixed through time. In that paper I was talking about that we did, looking at wolf predation rates on deer this past winter, in that paper we have a table where we summarized all the data that's and all the papers that have been collected and research done to estimate how often wolves kill deer. And so we did a thorough deep dive in this, and there really isn't much to really indicate or to really help anyone learn how many deer wolves are actually killing on an annual basis or how many adult equivalents. So that's the first part. The second one is about what impact predation on fawns might be having on the deer population. Um, we think it's very unlikely that a predation on fawns would be having an impact on deer in any meaningful way. And the reason why is most fawns in theory, are just born to be eaten or to die of some cause. When we look at wolf mortality studies, or not, sorry, fawn mortality studies, in most places, most fawns die, regardless of whether or not there are wolves present in those areas. And actually, some of the highest or higher fawn survival rates in places like Minnesota have happened in wolf range. The average, there was a study in the Ely area that found that fawn survival was, I think, 45% or 48%. There was another one done near Grand Rapids, Minnesota. I think that was somewhere in that similar range. There's been studies done in wolf range in Wisconsin and also the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And all of those studies have found that average fawn survival rates in those places are actually higher than the continental average, which is about 40 to 41%. And that was based on a meta-analysis that was done a couple years ago. So it doesn't seem to jive that wolves that low fawn survival potentially from wolves and other predators would be the impact. I think if wolves were to have an impact on deer populations, it would be killing adult does during the winter time or other times of the year, because adult does are really what drive population change because of their capacity to produce offspring and to do so sometimes very prolifically in the right conditions. Um, Liz says, do you anticipate wolves will move south to increase their ability to thrive because of the plethora of prey? If people weren't around, I'm sure wolves would. I mean, wolves would have no problem living if people would be okay with them in Iowa, southern Minnesota, Twin Cities, etc. But the reality is that as wolves start to get closer and closer to higher areas with more and more people, that often is a recipe for conflict, and wolves start getting removed. So, there's nothing, let's say, stopping them in sense that a wolf could start running down to those areas now, and some do get to those places, but most of those wolves don't last very long. It doesn't seem because they're killed for one reason or another. They're illegally or not. Sometimes they're illegally shot. Sometimes they're mistaken for a coyote. Sometimes they're hit by a car. So it's not a matter of whether or not they could live there. It's a matter of whether or not people would allow them to live there. And I think that so far has been that people are not going to let them live in those places. How common is it for a wolf to kill livestock? That's a hard rate to figure out. Obviously, wolves kill livestock in Minnesota, Wisconsin, pretty much anywhere there's wolves. Wolves will be killing livestock at some point in time. Now, in terms of a probability of how much they kill livestock, that's a different um, thing that's hard to calculate, like how often they will do that. But what's actually quite amazing to me, I think, is the fact of how little wolves kill livestock, not because wolves aren't causing issues for people, but because livestock are sort of vulnerable prey that if a wolf figured out, oh, I can just eat calves, in theory, they would have no problem killing a lot of vulnerable calves or things like that. And yet, from our work, where we had a large cattle ranch and we had wolves on that ranch a lot around vulnerable calves, most wolves never messed with the calves, never tried to eat them or cause any issues. And I think that's quite surprising. And so, what often made me wonder is why don't wolves kill more of them? Because it seems like such a no-brainer, but there's something about it that they don't make that connection that calves are food or that vulnerable livestock are food. Now, that's a double-edged sword because when they do make that connection, wolves are very good at taking advantage of food sources and learning how to come back to the same food sources through time. And so that's often why really the only choice you have a lot of instances when wolves start an individual starts killing livestock is to remove that individual because it's extremely difficult to break that habit when they figured that. Okay. Any theories as to why northern Minnesota wolf densities are so high compared to other areas? Yeah, so I think what we're going to find, and we're working on this, and some of this is coming together as we look at all of this. I think the reason why we have really high wolf densities in our area is because of the dense beaver population. I think that provides wolves with a substantial amount of food, and especially during summer. And while winter is an important time for wolves, it's actually summer that's probably the most important. In particular, the period during the pup rearing season and the late pup rearing season in sort of late summer, late summer, early fall, because that's when most pups don't make it past because wolves can't get enough food. And what we suspect, and this is, we're speculating here, but I think we're going to at some point have the data to illustrate this, is that dense beaver populations allow wolves to have smaller territories than if they were totally reliant on deer. And so that ability to have smaller territories because of beavers, on average, means that you can pack more wolves in an area, which means you have higher density of wolves in this area. So that's I think what we're going to find through time, and we're working on exploring that from a variety of angles to try to make sense of that because it's fascinating to us as well because we do not have an area that's known for having high deer densities. And so if you look at the stuff I was talking about earlier in the webinar, that wolf density is often driven by prey density. What I didn't get into the details of is the greater Voyageurs ecosystem doesn't fit that pattern if you're only looking at like ungulate prey, just deer densities. And so then the question is, well, then if deer are not, in theory, if deer shouldn't be able to support the number of wolves we have on the landscape, then what is? And I suspect we're going to find that it's ultimately beavers that are playing an important role there. Um, are there any studies that you can relate to us that would indicate how hunting might affect the genetic diversity in the wolf population here in the Great Lakes region? Um, there were some studies after there was a study, I should say, after the hunting seasons in Minnesota, that looked at that question by looking at samples of harvested wolves. I can't recall what they found in doing that. I don't think there's really a huge concern for genetic diversity because while we have our sort of political boundaries that separate, Minnesota from Ontario and Wisconsin, et cetera, the reality is if you took away the political boundaries, if you're a wolf, you're really part of one really large contiguous population that basically goes from Minnesota all the way up to northern Canada, all the way to Manitoba, and huge areas. And so you have wolves that are probably constantly going into Canada from Minnesota, ones that are coming from Canada into Minnesota. We have wolves from Wisconsin going to Manitoba. I'm sure the other thing, it happens the other way around. And so, really, from a genetic standpoint, especially given the number of wolves that are around, you have 3,000 almost in Minnesota. I think Wisconsin's like 1,000. I can't remember. Michigan, 600 or 700 maybe. So you have 5,000 individuals, maybe a little less than that, in all the Great Lakes states, and then you have all of Ontario and Manitoba. So there, I think, is quite a bit of connectivity there in that population. Next question. If winters continue to be milder with climate change, can we expect a decrease in wolf populations because they have difficulty killing deer with less snow and warmer temps? Possibly, but the thing that could also happen too is that as you get climate change, and let's say the milder winters are that way, you might have deer populations that end up becoming then at higher levels on average. And so, as you get more deer on the landscape, there's going to be more, a percent of those deer are always going to be vulnerable, even in mild winters. And so, you might have a larger number of vulnerable deer, even though there's mild winters, because there's more deer on the landscape, if that makes sense. And so, it's hard to say whether or not climate change or milder winters long term will have a negative impact. I think what the challenge is when you're going when every winter fluctuates, when you have very severe winters, super mild winters, and then in between, that causes a lot of sort of random variability that goes on, and that has a lot of impacts on sort of those dynamics. Do you know if the wolf population is expanding south in Minnesota, or have they filled all prime habitats in the state? I'm curious because I'm from St. Cloud, and a pack was spotted near my area before wolf hunting in 2013, and no wolves have been around since. Certainly, in terms of just purely habitat, like I said, as you take people out of the equation, there's plenty of spots for wolves in the rest of Minnesota. Um, it's human tolerance that ultimately will dictate where they actually get to be. Um, is there data on wolf pack stability persistence having any effect on local livestock predation? You hear statements that indicate that's the case. I'm not so sure that really is the case. I've not seen a lot of compelling data that illustrates that clearly. Oftentimes, that's one of the rationales that's used to not hunt wolves is that you mess with pack stability and persistence, and then that somehow causes the instability causes young wolves or other wolves to start wandering nomadically, and then they start eating livestock more than they would otherwise, and so you actually create more problems by having wolf management. I don't think there's a lot of good data to suggest that's the case, and that it makes me I just don't yeah, I struggle to understand that that would actually be the case necessarily. So, and I'm not certainly not aware of any data that shows that well. All right, I'm gonna pour a quick drink here. One second. I just gotta, otherwise my throat's getting a little dry. Okay. Um, all right, there seems to be evidence the loss of pack parents can lead to younger pack members turning to livestock depredation, an easier prey if they haven't yet fully been habituated to hunting deer. If true, wouldn't wolf hunting potentially upset pack mechanics and therefore possibly lead to an increase in depredations? Oh, that's basically what I just answered. So same answer to the person just above you. A few years ago, your organization posted about wolves surviving on blueberries and beavers during the summer. Do you think wild berries and beavers on a property increase the likelihood that wolves will stay in the area? So one thing worth clarifying is beavers are certainly, as I just mentioned, an important food source for wolves in our area. Um, and so berries have an interesting role. I'll talk about that in a second. But I do want to, sometimes this has been skewed to indicate that we're suggesting wolves only live on berries and beavers during the summer, which simply is not true. Wolves' deer fawns are a very important part of that equation as well. And so we're not in any way suggesting that wolves are not killing fawns. And as we've already talked about, sometimes a lot of fawns during the summer. But in terms of berries, having beavers could, but really when you think about things from a wolf's perspective, you have to really consider the scale. And so oftentimes when we have property and things like that, we think about that on a very localized scale. But when you think about a wolf, you have to think about 100 square kilometer, 150 square kilometer area. Those are, so if you have beaver densities across that whole area that are high, then that is probably going to do something potentially to help pup survival, maybe. But when it's like one beaver pond here or there, there's just not enough beavers for the wolves to really invest a lot of time probably developing the skills and abilities to catch those beavers because there's just not a lot of them. So they're going to spend a lot of time moving around trying to find a few beavers, and that isn't going to be worth the effort. In our area, because there's so many beavers around, obviously it's a very valuable strategy to learn how to catch beavers because that's a huge food source if you can figure out how to do it because beavers are everywhere. In terms of berries, um, berries likely are not doing much for wolves other than just helping slow starvation. And that's about it. We don't think wolves are getting very much nutritionally or calorically from berries, maybe a very little bit, but wolves just do not have digestive systems that are designed to eat berries and plant matter, which is why often when wolves are eating berries, you see a bunch of full berries in their scats and things like that. And that's because wolves have very simple digestive systems meant to process meat, and processing meat is a lot simpler than processing material and things like that. So we consider berries really to be starvation food. Now, most wolves do it because what it likely does is it allows wolves to sit and eat berries. The berries probably taste good to the wolves. They can be very abundant. The wolves probably feel satiated from the water weight of the berries. And they do that instead of maybe wandering around looking for deer fawns that they might struggle to catch, or beavers that might not be on land a lot in the summer. And so berries are just sort of a way to eke through the summer. But there's nothing that indicates that that is good food for wolves. And I guarantee if you had a bucket of berries or a bucket of meat, a wolf would go for the meat every time, 100%, no doubt about it. Okay, how does the wolf density here compare to that of other locations? You mentioned a handful earlier in Denali, Yukon Charlie. Does the type of prey have a potential impact on that? So the type of prey can have an impact on, uh, to a degree, wolf density, but what really is more important for wolf density is the amount of prey biomass, because there's a trade-off with when you have larger bodied prey, usually the number of those prey, the density is lower. So, for example, high deer densities, let's say in wolf range, might be 15 deer per square kilometer, 20 deer per square kilometer. High moose densities are like 1.5, 2 moose per square kilometer. Those are really robust moose populations. So if a wolf is in a high moose density system, there still might be a lot of food around, but the total number of animals is lower. But if wolves are able to kill a moose, they get a lot more reward than they do for killing a deer. And so there's this sort of trade-off between the number of prey and the size of the prey. Typically speaking, wolf density is highest at lower latitudes and lowest at high latitudes. So when you get up into the Arctic, for instance, wolf densities might be 1 to 3 wolves per 1,000 square kilometers, which is a really low wolf density. Obviously, ours is 60 wolves per 1,000 square kilometers. And that's just because as you get further north, those ecosystems are less productive, meaning that they can support fewer prey, which means that there's fewer wolves in those systems. So it really has a lot more to do with the amount of, and that's why I'm going to stop here and say that's why in that one study they quantified prey abundance as prey biomass per square kilometer, because that accounts for this different body size and abundance of prey. So if you look at it purely just from the amount of food per square kilometer, it sort of allows you to kind of smooth over those differences in prey body size, prey abundance, and things like that. And generally, as you go further north, prey biomass goes down. Okay, next question. Did any of the wolf hunting and trapping studies indicate if the hunt trap coincided with the wolf breeding season? Were wolves harvested during breeding seasons? So in some of the hunting and trapping seasons, as I kind of talked about, like sometimes there is removal during the breeding season. They'll just be open during it, but not all of the harvesting activity is concentrated at that time. That one instance in Wisconsin was sort of this, 200 wolves being killed in 3 days is pretty much unheard of anywhere else for a recreational hunting and trapping season. And it all happened at the same time. And so that had a really big impact. Whereas if you had, let's say, 200 wolves killed, but that was spread out from November through March, yeah, you might kill some in the breeding season, but that impact might be a lot less pronounced because it's sort of spread across a much larger time frame. The other thing I would note in Minnesota's wolf management plan is if there were to be a hunting season, it would be in the late fall to, I believe, February 1st. And the reason why is to not remove wolves during that breeding season and give wolves time. Let's say a breeding animal is taken out from a pack in December. Well, that gives time, a month, maybe a month and a half, for another wolf to take that position and keep that pack sort of reproducing that year. What pack wolf was your colleague looking for at Silver Lake near Elephant Lake? Um, So in this area, north of Elephant Lake, or the north side, this is a lake in our study area. North of Elephant and Black Duck Lake is what's called the Bug Creek Pack. That pack goes from the northern side of those lakes all the way up basically to Sheep Ranch Road, over to almost Long Lake, all the way almost over to Highway 53, and then south of that, and south of County Road 180 is the Thuya Pack. They occupy most of the southern side of Black Duck and Elephant Lakes. Are there other similar studies on wolves in other areas? I'd love to learn more about other populations as well. Um, since we covered a lot of stuff, I'm not sure exactly what that's specifically referring to, but there are a variety of studies that have been done on red wolves. None that are maybe exactly on the topics I've talked about today, but folks have definitely done stuff there. And obviously, Mexican wolves, there's several studies and reports on that as well. How many wolves are in a pack on average? In our area, the average is about 4.5. It sometimes varies between 4 to 4.5 on average. So we have relatively small wolf packs in our area. If hunting of wolves in Idaho, Wyoming, Montana does not decrease the population and apparently, in quotes, does not decrease predation, what might it take to encourage cattlemen to implement other actions? Livestock, guarding dogs, fladry, bunching of cattle, thoughts. Um, it's really hard to say. I think with wolves, as probably everyone here knows, like there's a lot of strong feelings that go well that have been going on in humanity with wolves for a very long time. And so some of them are things that are probably more, there are can't be changed. I think there's probably some practical things. If all of those things were free and didn't cost people a lot of effort, maybe they would do it because it was just available. I suspect, there's probably a lot of folks who might not maybe be big fans of wolves who raise livestock, but who also would like to be free of worrying about these problems. And so obviously, having the ability to implement actions that help and reduce those possibilities probably would be appreciated if they don't have to pay for a ton of it and they don't have to, basically wear or carry the cost associated with it. Because a lot of those non-lethal um, tools are a lot of work. Guard dogs take time. Bunching cattle. I've just done a fencing project in our area. Like these things require a lot of time and resources, and so there's probably very little incentive for someone who has a ranch and is having problems to pursue these on their own because it just doesn't make economic sense and it's a lot of work on their end. So in my opinion, I think that you should, um, uh, yeah, I think there should probably be an economic incentive that would probably change things quite a bit. Okay, someone says, where have you placed trail cameras on Silver Lake? This person's very interested in Silver Lake. I would say, just so nobody pops a squat in that direction, I'd say just shoot me an email, or shoot our project an email that goes to me, and I can tell you where they're at, and we can go from there. Any significant human-wolf interaction issues in the area? Uh, Nothing that comes to mind. Every once in a while, people will encounter a wolf that just kind of looks at him and things like that, but there's been nothing that has anything to do with human safety or anything like that. Obviously, we're in the field all the time by ourselves with a large field crew, and obviously we're going to all the spots wolves are at, and we've never had any significant issue. I understand changing human behavior is hard. Okay, yeah. I see that where that one came in now. I know that in Europe, following the fall, the Iron Curtain wolves are returning to places from which they have disappeared. There's not much knowledge in these areas. Do you share your results internationally? Well, we share our results internationally in the sense that our peer-reviewed papers are available to academics pretty much everywhere, and often easily accessible. We do talk with folks. We chat with researchers from Switzerland, France, Germany, the Netherlands. So we do have correspondence. It's obviously with internet and email. It's pretty easy, and ultimately, it's not a huge world in terms of people who are studying wolves in these places. So there is collaboration in that sense, and obviously, if folks reach out to us, we're happy to share what we can with them. Do wolves prey on coyotes? We have yet to document an instance of that occurring in our area. wolves will kill coyotes in terms of competition. I have no doubt that it will happen. Um, I just don't think it's probably something that happens all the time. Because yeah, I think in part there's a lot of effort that wolves have to spend going after coyotes, and in our area, I have no doubt that like if a wolf could readily kill one, they would. But I also don't think they're going to expend an incredible amount of energy doing it. And like I said, we have yet to document an instance of that occurring. Though we did get last year some trail camera footage, which is on our social media, of wolves of a wolf chasing a coyote for a short period. How long that lasted, we don't know. Um, do deer migrate, expand their ranges with increasing density? Um, Assuming browse might be a limiting factor. I really don't know the answer to that question. I don't know. I'm skeptical whether or not browse might be a limiting factor for deer in our area, um, especially given the densities and the fact that if given mild winters, deer populations generally increase and sometimes can increase quite quickly. That would suggest that that's not a browse factor. That might be the issue. That's really a winter conditions issue. Because if it was browse, it would then we just wouldn't see deer populations being able to uh, grow to the numbers they are. Now, there is a point, I suppose, if deer got abundant enough, which hasn't doesn't seem like it's been the case for a very long time, that maybe that becomes an issue. But I think deer populations would have to increase quite a bit before they did that. Um, Next question is that lower biomass but higher return targets why northern animals are often larger as well? I'd heard that larger animals, to a certain ratio, have more efficient metabolisms. So yeah, so there's a pattern that's known as Bergmann's rule that basically states that animals in a species, as you basically get further north or to the poles, the body size of those animals gets bigger. So you think about white-tailed deer, you get further south, the body of deer are smaller. As you get up north, bodies of deer typically get larger. And that pattern's been documented. That's true of wolves in some instances as well. Um, I don't know though if that's connected to why northern animals are necessarily larger. There's a lot of things going on in terms of metabolism, thermoregulation, and things like that of why having a larger body might be more advantageous in those climates. So I can't necessarily connect it to that. A lot of that just comes down to, though, about the lower biomass is really a result of the productivity of those ecosystems. There's just short growing seasons, less food, and so it just cannot support a lot of animals, regardless, or a lot of prey animals, regardless of the size of the animals. I recently saw that MNDNR was looking at expanding elk herds in the state. Obviously, I already have moose, so it may not change. But if elk would spread across the state, is it likely average wolf pack size would increase with more large prey? Could Minnesota wolves evolve to be larger, more like Western wolves with more large prey? If elk became the dominant prey, that's possible. I think the challenge is that it would really require sort of there to be a really distinct population of wolves that sort of remained in an area where there were predominantly elk, and elk were the primary food source for you to really start seeing a substantial change in, let's say, wolf body size. And then also probably meaningful changes in wolf pack size. So at this point, it's really hard to say what that might look like down the line. Especially because from what I understand, unless elk really start spreading all across Minnesota and becoming really dominant relative to white-tailed deer, I suspect that elk are going to be kind of relegated to very small pockets of the state, like they are in some other Great Lakes states. And so you're going to have wolves that might occupy territories that have elk, but elk may or may not be the primary prey. And those wolves, when they disperse out of that territory where there's elk, will probably end up somewhere where there aren't elk. And so there's really not something that would allow them to adapt, generation after generation to become larger through time. And then Sue asks, is writing a children's book in your future plans for education outreach? Not as of right now, but it's not something we're going to rule out, I would say, either. I think that's why we made it through. Are there other questions? We've got some more time. If not, obviously, no worries. But if there's any other questions, I'm happy to answer them for a little bit longer. All right. Um, so in his, what are you drinking? That's a great question. So I'm drinking a bourbon called Smoke Wagon. I'll hold it up here. I'm a fan of some whiskeys, and this one's uh it's a distillery out of Las Vegas, and it's very good. So, and it tastes good because my throat was getting kind of scratchy there. So okay, what else do we have here? Not a question, but just want to say another informative and wonderful presentation, Tom. Thank you, appreciate that. Okay, here's another one. On your Facebook, you shared a video of a wolf eating roadkill with another wolf in the background. Was that wolf just skittish about being close to the camera person, or was it guarding the young wolf who was eating? Based on, we didn't record that video, but the person who did shared it with us and answered some question. That person who recorded the video actually didn't even realize that there was a wolf in the background. I only, when I watched it, and I'd watched it a couple times before I noticed that, and I said, "Oh, did you know there's another wolf?" And she didn't even realize that there was one in the background. My guess is that wolf was staying back there to avoid people. The wolf that was eating that roadkill deer was clearly a pup, and pups often do sometimes some really dumb things around people. They take risks that are not good risks necessarily to be taking. And often adult wolves are going to be more uh, wary of taking those risks. And so yeah, so I that's my guess is what was going on there. What are any research topics you'd like to explore in the future on this subject of wolves and deer predation? Well, one thing that we're going to start doing this hopefully next winter is we have grant funding that's supposed to come through that will allow us to GPS collar deer. And so, what we're really interested in when looking at wolf deer interactions is understanding, we have the wolf predation side of things where we know how many deer wolves are killing. And we can estimate rates and why that changes through time with snow conditions. But there's obviously then getting data from the deer side of things and understanding when deer, on a population level, like what percent of the population is being removed relative to the number of deer collared. So you can estimate predation rates differently that way. Um, you can also, one thing we're really interested in is understanding what role habitat plays in terms of wolf predation on deer. In other words, do deer that spend time in certain habitats have higher survival rates than deer in other ones? Because this might provide some good information on how you can, let's say, configure habitats that might improve deer's ability to survive really harsh winters. So, for instance, do deer that yard up in these really old cedar yards do they have higher survival than deer that hang out in, let's say, maybe less optimal habitat? And maybe they don't. I don't know. So those are going to be interesting things to observe. And then obviously, because we have collared deer and collared wolves, we're going to get a lot of information of sort of those interactions with one another. So that'll be really interesting. And I think there's a lot of sort of fascinating insights we might glean through doing that. And one question we're also really interested in is we measure deer population change through time, and that's how we kind of determine how the deer population changes. But one thing that we're very interested in is understanding what is the range of wolf predation on deer. Like we've got sort of the mildest winter in recorded history was last year, and we kind of have a benchmark. Well, we don't know because we've not studied wolves during a very severe winter. It's unfortunate we hadn't started this a couple years ago. It would have been, it's really, what we're really curious is like, what kind of predation levels do we see during that time? And we know it's got to be pretty high, but what is it exactly? And what does that mean in terms of wolf consumption of the kills that they're making? Are they killing a deer every day in these really severe winters, two a day? One every 3 days. Like we just don't know. And so it's just being generally curious about how that works and being curious in wolf predation patterns. It would be very interesting to see that because most of the year when we're studying wolves, they're killing a deer when they're with a pack, once every 3, 5, 7 days, depending, even longer than that in the fall sometimes. And so if we ever got to a point where it's like also now the conditions are right that they're killing a deer, like let's say every day, that would be really quite fascinating to see that shift in predation behavior and be able to document it. Um, do you ever hire biologists outside of the University of Minnesota? Unfortunately, we will bring on folks that help for our winter field season. So if you want to be part of our winter field crew, that's certainly something we can. Because we don't really have the funding to hire other biologists. We're just trying to keep the lights on as they are. We don't have any opportunities that will be coming available for anyone to sort of work as a biologist. Maybe someday we'll get to that point, but that's not where we're at right now. What have you found about the relationship between black bears and wolves? Well, we have yet to find an instance. I know I'm going to talk about the phenomenon that some folks have been curious about wolves pulling black bears out of dens and killing them. Some folks say that that happens quite a bit. We have yet to document any behavior like that during our winter predation work. You know, we're studying wolves now, and then obviously last winter, and we've not even come across anything like that opportunistically yet. Um, we do know that black bear hunting in Minnesota has impact to an extent on wolf-bear interactions because bear hunting is often done by putting bait piles up, and those are done in the late summer, and that's when wolves are pretty desperate for food, and so you have a lot more interactions with wolves and bears around these bait piles. We've only documented, I think, 7 or 8 predation events of wolves on black bears over 10 years, and almost all of that has occurred during that bear hunting season. Um, that could be due to the spatial overlap of wolves and bears at these bait piles. It could also be due to the fact that during the bear hunting season, some bears are wounded but not killed, and then wolves see that as a really vulnerable prey animal that they can then kill and get a lot of meat. I mean, an adult bear is a lot of food for a wolf. So if they think they can do that, I have no doubt wolves will kill a bear. In most instances, though, a wolf just wouldn't be able to do that. And then we see wolves scavenging black bears or carcasses of black bears a lot during that bear hunting season as well. These are from bears that have been successfully harvested and then field dressed. So there's a gut pile, and the wolves will go scavenge that. After bears are butchered and the meat is taken, hunters will dispose of the carcasses. Wolves will find those and consume those. And then sometimes hunters aren't able to recover a bear for whatever reason, and wolves will find those. And for a wolf, that's like winning the jackpot or the lottery to find a dead bear in the woods would be a huge source of food for them. So that's the yeah, to me, I think that's the most interesting aspect is sort of the role of how bear hunting it brings those two together. And we're working on some research right now to look at that pattern, and hopefully we can have some updates on that, and maybe it'll be a future webinar someday in the future. Are you aware of any regulations in the U.S. about harvesting wolves that are collared? There's no regulations. I don't know if any. I'm not aware of any states that have regulations like that. In many places, um, biologists don't want hunters or trappers to avoid, let's say, killing a collared wolf because it then sort of limits your ability to understand what impact a hunting and trapping season might actually be having on the population if you're using collared wolves as a way to estimate survival and things like that. Because in theory, the collared wolves that you're studying should be a representative sample of the larger population. But if people are, let's say, selectively not killing collared wolves, then all of a sudden you don't have a population or study sample that is representative of the larger population. And this is true of a lot of wildlife species, not just wolves. So I can see, yeah, now if someone wasn't interested in survival, maybe they might not want them removed because then they don't care, they just want to keep the collar out. But I'm not aware of any instances of that. If you could pick any other geographic area in the world to research wolves, where would it be and why? Realistically, it would probably be like probably way up in the Arctic. I think that just looks like such a cool landscape. And obviously such a remote and almost otherworldly. And when you read about people who've studied wolves in that area and watch wolves killing muskox and snowshoe hares, that just sounds, yeah, really amazing. So I don't think that would probably be feasible to live up there, obviously, and do that kind of work, but it certainly sounds really fascinating to be able to do something like that. Any other questions here? It says, could you use capture mark recapture model to estimate how many deer are eaten by wolves each year? If both are collared with population estimates, you could maybe estimate it. Um, yeah, possibly. There's a lot of assumptions with capture mark recapture models, and it would still require you to I'm not exactly sure how you would do that. And I would also say if you have deer that are already collared, and just like I was talking about with wolves, in theory, if you collar a bunch of deer, that should be a representative sample of the deer population. And so then from that you can determine what percentage of that population is killed by wolves. And in theory, that should be close to the actual rate, right? If the deer you're studying are a representative sample and you have enough of them collared at a given time to have a large enough sample size. So I'd say it's possible you could come up with a method, but I'm guessing at that point there's probably easier ways to get that estimate, or at least ones that might be more reliable. What's your favorite or most unique wolf behavior you've seen? Um, oh goodness. I don't know. I mean, I probably don't have anything that's like super novel. I guess when we in 2017, I was able to watch, which was the first time we had documented a wolf that was trying to catch a fish, a sucker in a stream, and that was really the beginning of our understanding of wolf predation on fish, which we've now learned that wolves spend a lot of time catching fish in the spring, and that was really fascinating to be able to just to see. That was really cool, and I just sat there. It was very sort of intimate to watch that. Um, one thing I watched, I also was really fortunate about 7 years ago. I was just out doing field work in the spring and watched three wolves. The ice was really bad, and it looked like the wolves had chased a deer onto the ice, but then the deer fell through the ice. And this was like spring, it was warm, sunny. And I sat on a rocky point and watched these three wolves slowly trying to get this deer carcass out of the ice. And I had luckily had my binoculars with me that day and they were kept trying to get this deer out of the ice, but then the wolves would break through the ice and they couldn't get it, and they sat there. I probably watched for an hour as they just kept trying to pull this deer to shore. The deer was dead, I should note, and they kept falling through the ice. So, anyways, I thought that was really cool because in our area we just have such few observations of wolves. We don't get to watch them aside from trail cameras to see them in person. And so sitting there for like an hour watching them just do that and having no idea that I was there and I was a long ways away. That was really, really kind of cool. Wish that we had more moments like that. This one says, I heard that wolves in Montana may be taking plastic trash as chew toys for pups. Do you see plastic litter near wolf dens in your area? Haven't seen anything like that. We have found stuff in wolf scats. That's just weird stuff that wolves are eating. Like that maybe wolves are consuming as toys. I mean, we've definitely found plastic, found Land of the Lakes, butter wrappers. That might be for food. One year we found a chunk of a jersey, like a basketball jersey in a scat, chunks of rubber. Um, we've seen other instances where wolves have chewed on, or it looks like they've chewed on plastic pieces at like clusters of GPS locations we visit. But yeah, nothing at dens specifically. Do you use or have any interest in using those collar cameras? So we actually did use those. To our knowledge, we were actually the first to put out GPS collars with cameras in 2000 and what was that? I think 19 or 20, one of those 2 years. And we used those. We deployed some in 2020 and then 2021. And while we really liked, like the information was interesting to see. I mean, it was cool to see things from a wolf's perspective. The utility of camera collars, and from at least for what we're trying to do, which is study predation over a long period of time, is pretty limited because the battery only lasts for a short period of time if you want to get data regularly. And we just realized that we would rather have a wolf wearing a GPS collar that's going to last 2 years as opposed to one that might last, uh, you know, 12, um, 12 days, maybe 20 days, depending on the schedule of how often the collar takes videos. So I do know other folks are using that, and I can see why, particularly in really remote settings where maybe doing field work is really, really difficult, that those collars might provide some useful data. But for us, they just didn't have a lot of utility for the goals we were trying to do. But we are working on some research to try to summarize what we found based on the collar data that we collected. And someone says, yes, if I remember, wet fur covered the camera lens. That was also part of it. We did figure that out. The first year we put them out, there was wolf fur that kind of covered the lens of the camera. And we learned the second year you got to trim that and that was really interesting. Trying to trim a wolf's really dense winter coat in the spring is a lot more difficult than we imagined. And when we first did it, I thought I would bring, we had the wolf, and we brought just clippers like you would clip your hair, and that instantly clogged up when we were trying to just, we thought we'd quickly shave it, and the fur is just way too dense, and we didn't have a lot else, at least for the first one, so we used like on a Leatherman, the little scissor attachment, and that was a very long process to just trim the fur in front of that. We figured out the next time how to do that a little bit better. um, the question is, what sort of spotting scope setup do you use? So we don't use any spotting scopes because we just never have the opportunity to do it. And any observation we might get, we could just use binoculars because they're going to be close enough. So like when I did way, way back before I started on the project here, when I was in college, I worked as a sort of research technician at Grand Teton National Park, doing some wolf research there. And we use spotting scopes, and there obviously they're very functional because you can see a really long ways. But in Minnesota, that's not the case. Um, is there a chance that the Voyageurs Wolf Project will expand to all of Minnesota? No, we've got plenty to do just to study the wolves in our area. Though obviously it would be very interesting if there were similar studies in different parts of Minnesota, because there are other parts of Minnesota that are very different than where we're at, that also have wolves. You feel like you lose diet data since you don't do scat analysis anymore. Um, Not really. I mean, we do lose some data on diets by collecting scats and going through them. But I think the data that we get on wolf predation behavior by visiting, finding all of their kills throughout the summer is ultimately a lot richer data set than what we would get from wolf scats. And wolf scats take a lot of time to collect. There's a lot of assumptions in wolf diet estimates when you use scats. Some of them are not always bad, but it does make some aspects of it challenging, and it's just a ton of work to get through those scats, identify all that remains, and things like that. So we're pleased we did that for 5 years, and we determined that was enough work for us collecting wolf scats. And do we ever use drones? No, we've never used drones for our work, and I don't think we're going to try anytime soon. Alrighty. Well, we're almost at 9 o'clock here, so I'm gonna stop the Q&A right now. Thank you, everybody, um, for your time, for sticking around, for asking questions. Hopefully, this was informative, and we are gonna try to get out a recorded version of this, hopefully by tomorrow if we can get it uploaded in time. And if you don't get it for some reason, uh, I don't know why that would happen, but feel free to reach out to us, and we'll make sure you get a copy of it. So. Thanks, everybody. We really appreciate it.